its cell body somewhere in the middle of its body, because that is the only distinctive feature of a sensory neuron. So you just draw something that looks like this, somewhere in the middle of the body, you put a zumba there, and you know that's the cell body of a sensory neuron. Why? Because when you look at a motor neuron, it looks like a Rastafari, and there's a face that has dreadlocks. And when you look at I'm sorry. Alright guys, let's move. We said, come back. A neuron has a basic structure. It must have a dendrite, and a dendrite must always be before a cell body. And after a cell body, a part of a neuron that transmits impulses away from the cell body must be an axon. Let us look at the sensory neuron. This is our receptor. If you see a cell body there, no matter how long that extension is, saying dendrite does not mean shorter than an axon. A dendrite is any part of a neuron that is before a cell body. So it means that this whole region in a sensory neuron, good people, is a what? Is a dendrite. Why? Because dendrites always transmit impulses towards the cell body of a neuron. I'm making sense? Yes? Yes. Good. So we are saying neurons are nerve cells. The first one that we are talking about is the sensory neurons. Sensory neurons are afferent neurons. Why? Because they take impulses from receptors to our central nervous system, and they have a basic plan which starts with a dendrite, then a cell body, and then a what, guys? An axon. How do nerve impulses travel through a neuron? Dendrites transmit impulses to the cell body, and axons transmit impulses away from the cell body. So dendrite towards cell body, and axon away from the cell body. Because electrical impulses are traveling on the dendrites and the axons of neurons are insulated, or they are covered by what we call the myelin sheath. A myelin sheath, good people, is an insulator. It covers our electrical impulses that are traveling in our axons. Think of an extension cord. Now, what's inside of this cord, good people? There's wires, right? If I pour water on this extension cord, will anything happen? No. But if the wires are exposed and there's no insulator, what will happen? The electricity that is being transmitted will be disturbed. And the same thing happens to neurons. Because nerve impulses are like electrical impulses, axons must be covered, so that if two neurons ever have any form of physical contact with each other, nerve impulses do not move from one neuron to the next. So this insulator is protecting a nerve impulse that is traveling through a neuron, and it is preventing multi-communication between different types of neurons in our brains. So one neuron can be stimulated at a time with people. What do we know about sensory neurons? They are always sending impulses towards our brain. Why? Because they are afferent neurons. They have a cell body somewhere in the middle of the body, and before the cell body, that's a dendrite. After the cell body, that part is called the what, good people? An axon. An axon. So number 2, we say that sensory neurons are attached to receptors on one end. We need to know what happens on the other end. At the end of an axon of a neuron, that part there is called an axon terminal. So every neuron starts at a dendrite and ends at what we call an axon terminal. Axon terminal. That is the end, the last piece of a neuron. Neurons, good people, are like electrical wires. They do not touch one another. They must never touch one another. So even if two neurons were to communicate, those two neurons can never be in contact with each other. And then number 2, there's a microscopic gap that exists between two neurons. And this gap is called a synapse. So I'm going to talk about neuron synapses. Two neurons communicate through a very small gap that exists between them, and that gap is called a what, guys? A synapse. Why? Because two neurons must never touch each other. That is going to disturb the flow of a nerve impulse in that particular neuron. I'm going to talk about a synapse now before I talk about connector or neurons. Stop me, good people, if I'm moving too fast. Am I moving too fast? No? Alright, let's go. Let's go. Asan, synapse. Synapse. A synapse is a functional connection between the axon terminal of one neuron and the dendrites of another neuron. You memorize this definition with people. A synapse is a functional connection, is the transmission of an impulse from an axon terminal right at the end of one neuron to the beginning of another neuron, which is the dendrites of the second neuron. I'm going to talk about a synapse between a sensory neuron and a connector neuron. At the end of an axon terminal of a sensory neuron, at the end, okay, but it's fine. This axon terminal is the tip of an axon of a neuron. We call this swelling here a synaptic knob. We call this a synaptic knob. Yeah. And then there's one neuron there, and here my drawing comes. I'm trying. And then obviously that will be a synaptic knob of a dendrite of another neuron. And then number two, this microscopic space or gap between the two neurons, this is our what people, this is our synapse science, and we call this a synaptic gap. It's a synaptic gap. Never know. Why are you not writing? The drawing and when the Zambians in this one.